They left Knoxville just after sunrise, the kind of Tennessee August morning where the air sits heavy on your skin before the day even begins. 7 friends, cars packed with cooler ice, backpacks, thrift store sleeping bags, and that late summer fear that life was about to speed up again. Classes were starting soon, part-time jobs were waiting, but not today. Today was supposed to be their last shot at feeling young. Tyler Hayes filmed the whole thing. His father's silver Sony Hi-8 camcorder rode shotgun in his lap as they pulled out of the apartment lot, the screen jittering as he panned across the group. Tyler was the quiet one, steady, cautious, always the planner. He'd printed maps, circled routes, even checked the weather twice. A soft-spoken 21-year-old who tried his best to keep chaos from finding them. Chaos, of course, found them anyway. In the Jeep ahead of him, Drew Callahan leaned halfway out the window like he was hosting a travel show no one asked for. Loud, fearless, and convinced he was immortal the way only a 22-year-old can be. His girlfriend, Katie Monroe, was laughing beside him, auburn hair whipping outside the window as she filmed the small caravan behind them. Behind the Jeep rolled the faded green Saturn belonging to Emily Ward, a journalism major whose professors always said she saw what others missed. Emily's roommate, Brianna, rode shotgun. She supplied the kind of commentary that would have made their home video a comedy special if things had turned out differently. The last car held Jordan McCoy and his girlfriend, Leah Parsons. Jordan was the outdoors guy, seasoned hiker, Eagle Scout, the one everyone trusted to pick the route. Leah had never camped a day in her life, but she wanted to, for him. The plan was simple. Cherokee National Forest, a trail Jordan heard about online, a supposedly abandoned fire lookout tower perched somewhere on a ridge west of Black Hollow. Something rustic, he said, something cinematic. The forest had other plans. The tape recorded their first stop of the morning, a gas station near Tellico Plains, the kind of place where the soda machine rattles louder than the passing trucks. You can see Drew pretending to hold a microphone interviewing the others while they buy beef jerky and off-brand candy, the kind of footage you'd laugh at later, if there had ever been a later. By late afternoon, they reached a gravel pull-off that looked like a mistake on any map. The forest behind it stretched like a green ocean, dense and whispering in the wind. Tyler filmed everything as they unloaded. Tents, cheap lanterns, the cooler, Jordan's compass. Katie asked him quietly, "Are we sure this is the right spot?" Jordan laughed, because of course he did. "Yeah, trailhead's right there." He pointed at something that looked more like a deer path than a hiking route. If anyone had turned around then, nothing that followed would have happened. But they didn't. They hiked 3 miles in before sunset painted the woods orange. The camera turned shaky around then, light fading, jokes thinning, branches scraping against the lens. The last daylight clip shows Leah whispering that she feels like they've been walking in circles. Tyler checking his compass, frowning. Something about the reading being off. Maybe mineral interference, maybe something else. They kept going anyway. The next clip jumps ahead to nightfall. A small fire crackles. Faces glow orange in the dark. They're sitting close, knees touching, leaning together, the way people do when the dark feels larger than the map said it would be. Brianna narrates as a joke, "Night 1, Black Hollow. We are officially lost and starving and probably dying."
It's warm, it's ordinary, until Tyler glances over his shoulder. Not long, not dramatic, just a flicker of unease at the tree line behind them. No one notices but the camera. It would take 4 days for anyone outside that forest to realize something was wrong. 7 friends were supposed to return Sunday evening. They didn't. By Monday, a few parents made calls. By Tuesday, someone mentioned that none of them had shown up for class. By Wednesday, both cars were still sitting untouched in that gravel lot. Keys missing, doors locked, gear stacked neatly in the trunks. 7 young people had walked into Cherokee National Forest on August 28, 1998. None of them walked out. Search teams arrived before dawn the next morning. Helicopters hovered low over the canopy. Volunteers formed lines across the undergrowth. Dogs were brought in. Radios hissed with static. Compasses spun 3 or 4 degrees off true north. Even the air felt strange, thick, muffled, like the forest was swallowing sound faster than it should. Small things turned up at first, a scrap of fabric, boot prints near a creek bed. But then the rain came. 30 straight hours, washing everything clean. Within 2 days, even the dogs lost the scent. Families gathered in the ranger station waiting room, eyes fixed on the tree line. Reporters circled like flies. Rangers quietly exchanged theories none of them could prove. By day 6, most of the volunteers were exhausted. By day 7, hope was thinning. By day 10, the forest felt like it wasn't searching with them, but against them. The only concrete clue arrived 2 weeks later, found by a hiker miles away from the search zone, a single mud-caked hiking boot. Size 7, women's, LaToya Parsons. It wasn't enough to explain anything. If anything, it made things worse. Locals began whispering about Black Hollow again, about the tower, about why the old trail had been removed from updated maps. Stories that hadn't been told in decades surfaced again, quietly, like people were afraid the woods might hear them. But no one, not the families, not the rangers, not the investigators, could have guessed that the real clue, the one that would reopen everything, was still lying out there, buried in mud, its battery dead, its tape intact. Waiting.
The camcorder surfaced nearly 3 months after the search was officially suspended. Winter had set in early that year, cold enough to quiet even the usual hikers who wandered the lower trails. On an overcast afternoon in late November, a man named Chris Delaney was making his way along a narrow creek bed not far from the state line. He liked to walk alone, said it cleared his head, and he wasn't looking for anything except maybe a good photograph of the last orange leaves clinging to the trees. But the forest had other plans. Half hidden beneath silt and blackened leaves, something metallic caught the light, a shape too straight, too manufactured to be part of the creek. Delaney crouched, pushed back wet mud with his fingertips, and lifted a small, rectangular object. The casing was cracked, dented as if it had collided with something hard. The lens was shattered, the strap coated in grime. It was a video camera. He wiped away the mud. The faded Sony logo came into view. He pressed the eject switch, and to his surprise, the chamber slid open. Inside sat a single high-8 tape, dull from water damage, but unmistakably intact. And on its handwritten label, smudged but legible, OG98 Trip. Delaney had no idea what he'd just found. He carried it to the nearest ranger station, not knowing that phone calls would soon be made, that families who'd been living with an empty ache for months would feel that ache sharpen again, that investigators, many already reassigned to other cases, would be called back. Within 24 hours, the sheriff's office confirmed it. The camera belonged to the missing group. Technicians at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation worked painstakingly to clean the tape. They dried it, brushed off silt, and transferred the footage frame by frame into digital format. Some expected the tape to be mostly ruined. Others quietly hoped for answers they were afraid to articulate. When the footage finally played, a room full of investigators fell silent. The first 30 minutes were almost comforting, painfully so. 7 young adults laughing as they crossed a shallow creek. Drew making jokes in a mock survivalist voice. Brianna teasing Jordan about his mystical compass. Katie singing off-key as she walked. Emily filming wildflowers and mushrooms like she was already writing the article in her head. Leia asking how much further until camp. You could almost believe, that the story would end differently. But then the footage shifted. A timestamp blinked. The camera angle changed, jarring and uneven. The sky was gone, the sun gone. Only darkness and the frantic beam of a flashlight remained. The person holding the camera was breathing hard, really hard, like they'd been running. Leaves whipped past, branches scraped across the lens. For a few seconds, the picture went black, as if the camcorder had been pressed against someone's chest or jacket. Then a whisper, "Hold on, stop, stop." It was impossible to tell who said it. The voice was thin, trembling. Somewhere in the distance, a faint metallic clanging echoed. Slow, rhythmic, almost like chains tapping against hollow steel. Investigators leaned forward. Some held their breath. The flashlight beam darted again, catching only trees. More whispering. A muffled cry. Then one sentence, barely audible. "Someone's out there." The room went cold. Moments later, the footage dissolved into chaos. The camera jolted violently as if dropped or swung while running. A voice shouted something, panicked. Maybe a name, maybe a warning. No one could decipher it. The image cut out again. Then, suddenly, the picture returned, and there it was. The fire lookout tower, exactly the way Jordan had described it online. Weathered metal frame, long abandoned, the door at its base hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The flashlight beam trembled over it. In the background, wind, or something like wind, moved through the trees with a low, wavering howl. The footage glitches, the picture warps. Then the tape ends. For days afterward, analysts pored over the final 15 minutes. They watched it at full speed, at half speed, frame by frame, pixel by pixel. They filtered noise, enhanced audio, brightened shadows, slowed everything down until seconds stretched like hours. That's when they found it. 3 seconds before the blackout, just before the camera dipped downward. A shape appeared between two trees, almost invisible at first. Investigators thought it might be a trick of light, maybe a warped shadow. But then, they stabilized the frame. The shape sharpened. It wasn't one of the 7 campers. The silhouette was too tall by at least a foot. The posture rigid, motionless. It stood just left of the flashlight beam, facing directly toward the camera, watching. The discovery created a national media frenzy. For a few weeks, the missing camper case dominated headlines again. Morning shows ran simplified versions of the footage. Experts debated whether the silhouette was human or an illusion caused by motion blur and low light levels. But the families knew better. They didn't need a debate to tell them what they already felt in their bones. Someone else had been in those woods. Audio technicians spent months scraping away layers of static from the final clip. They uncovered more than investigators expected. Underneath the metallic clanging was something faint, a kind of repetitive sound, spaced at intervals. It wasn't talking, not exactly. It could have been a voice, or crying, or maybe even laughter. No one could say for sure. In one segment, barely louder than a breath, a whisper seemed to form a word, maybe 2. The most optimistic analysts called it a possible vocalization. Skeptics dismissed it as artifact noise. But those who listened alone in their offices at night, those who had already spent years thinking about the 7 missing kids, recognized something more human in the static than they cared to admit. The tape raised far more questions than it answered. If the group reached the tower, why wasn't there any trace of them found there? If someone was watching them that night, who and where was he now? And why had the sunken, forgotten trail to Black Hollow vanished from updated forest maps years earlier? By early 1999, the case went cold again. But the tape wouldn't stay buried. Not this time. Investigators had seen the silhouette. They'd heard the whispers. And deep down, everyone involved understood the same grim truth. Whatever happened to those 7 friends didn't start with them. And it wasn't over yet. By the time winter loosened its grip on the mountains, the case was once again little more than a ghost story, drifting through Tennessee. The national news had moved on. Most of the volunteers went back to their lives. Even many investigators felt the chill of resignation settling in. The forest had already taken what it wanted, but none of the families could accept that. On any given weekend in early 1999, you could find 1 or 2 of them parked near the same gravel pull-off where the cars had been found. Emily Ward's brother came every Sunday with his own flashlight, hiking farther than rangers advised, whispering her name into cold air that refused to answer back. Tyler's father printed hundreds of missing posters, stapling them to telephone poles until rain peeled them away. Katie's mother kept her daughter's room exactly as she'd left it. Bed made, textbooks stacked, half-finished painting on the floor like she'd only stepped out for the weekend. Hope hung in the air like humidity, heavy, unrelenting, impossible to breathe around. But hope wasn't what the forest gave them next. Midway through the second week of renewed searches in 1999,
a volunteer reported seeing something unusual near a small drainage creek, something out of place, something darkened and oddly shaped. The area wasn't part of the official grid, too steep, too overgrown, too far from where the group was believed to have traveled. Still, a team hiked out. The creek wound uphill through dense brush that grabbed at their clothes, the kind of terrain that punished every step. By the time they reached the spot the volunteer described, the sun was already sinking, but even in the dimming daylight, the evidence was unmistakable. A clearing, barely larger than a small living room, wedged between dense pines. And at its center, a scorch mark. Not a simple fire pit, not something left by careless campers. The soil was blackened in a wide, uneven circle, littered with melted aluminum, charred nylon, and warped metal fragments. The heat that created it had been extreme, far beyond what a casual campfire could produce. Forensic technicians later estimated it reached temperatures that would have required accelerants or sustained fuel. But this wasn't the most unsettling part. The trees surrounding the clearing were untouched. Not a single burn mark, no scorched bark. Whatever had burned there had burned hot, yet never spread beyond the circle. It was as if the fire had been boxed in by something unseen. Investigators combed through the ashes, sifting with gloved hands. The fragments emerged slowly. A scorched camping pot, half of a melted shoe sole, plastic bottle caps fused into the dirt. A corner of blue tarp, the same type sold at an outdoor shop in Knoxville, where they knew Jordan had bought supplies. Yet there were no footprints, no cooking gear beyond the items consumed by the flames, no clothing, no evidence of human remains. It was like the group had camped there, but never lived there, as if they had been removed. A ranger crouched near the ashes, rubbing soot between his fingers. It's wrong. It's all wrong. When investigators sampled the soil, the results confirmed what everyone already felt: traces of accelerants that had no business being part of a normal campfire. Theories spread fast. Maybe the fire had been started to stay warm during the storm. Maybe someone panicked. Maybe someone else was there. But even these explanations collapsed under scrutiny. No one understood how such an intense blaze hadn't spread, or why it had been left so eerily undisturbed, as if time had decided to skip past that spot entirely. One volunteer later described standing in that clearing as the quietest moment of his life. Not peaceful, but suffocating, like the forest was holding its breath. When the teams returned the next morning, frost coated the blackened soil. The clearing looked even more unnatural in daylight. Investigators noted an odd detail: no wildlife tracks, no deer prints, no rabbit trail. Not even the tiny dotted lines of insects. Nothing entered that circle. Nothing left it. Still, no bodies.
No evidence of struggle. No explanation. Days stretched into weeks. The search radius expanded. Helicopters with infrared technology scanned the valleys. Dogs picked up trails that went nowhere. The forest's silence swallowed their efforts like it always did. And then, just as the last of the media trucks pulled away, another chilling detail surfaced. This time from locals. Black Hollow Ridge, the area where the campers were believed to have traveled, had been quietly avoided for decades. Not just because of rugged terrain, but because of history. The ridge held stories older than the park itself. Stories whispered in living rooms, in bars, over kitchen tables long after children were asleep. Stories about the old tower. Some said lightning had struck it long ago, killing a lookout who never left the mountain. Others blamed sinkholes, unstable ground, or mine shafts abandoned before World War II. But most spoke of the same thing in a dozen different ways. People went missing out there. Not many, just enough to notice. Enough to say the forest swallowed them in silence. Enough to explain why the trail leading to that tower, the one Jordan followed online, no longer appeared on up-to-date maps. Not as a mark, not even as a faint dotted line. Years earlier, someone had erased it. By the end of 1999, the investigation ran out of leads. Winter came again. Snow weighed heavy on the branches. Search operations dwindled to nothing. Families grieved the way only people with no answers grieve. Slowly, painfully, privately. For 2 years, the forest kept its secrets. And then, in April of 2001,
A maintenance worker clearing debris from a drainage culvert found something wedged between two rocks. A silver Sony H8 camcorder. The same one Chris Delaney had found 2 years ago, except this one had no tape inside, meaning the camera Delaney discovered, the one containing the infamous footage, hadn't been the only one the group carried. There had been another. A backup, one no one knew about. And that second camcorder, scratched, mud-covered, lens cracked, still held its own story. A story investigators would soon unravel, a story far darker than the first.
The second camcorder changed everything. It didn't contain a tape, at least not one that survived, but its discovery raised a question investigators should have realized sooner. If Tyler brought his father's camcorder and Emily brought hers, why had only one tape ever surfaced? The maintenance worker who found the device had no idea what he'd uncovered. To him, the battered silver casing was just another piece of junk, washed down the mountainside after heavy spring rains. But the moment the serial number was checked, silence fell across the station. It matched Emily Ward's camera, the same one she'd been filming with earlier in the trip, the same one that had recorded their jokes at the gas station, the same one that captured Leia's nervous smile on the first night. But this camcorder, Emily's camcorder, hadn't been lying in a creek for 2 years like Tyler's. It hadn't been weathered by sun or snow. The damage was newer, fresher. The mud still clung wet to the seams, meaning it hadn't been lying there since 1998, meaning someone or something had moved it long after the original disappearance. Investigators kept this detail from the public. For weeks, a small group of federal and state specialists examined every millimeter of the device. They cleaned it, dried it, cataloged every scratch, and then they found what they didn't want to find. Fibers embedded in the battery compartment. Fibers consistent with fabric from a nylon jacket. A jacket identical to the one Emily had been filming with earlier in the trip. The same one that had recorded their jokes at the gas station. The same one that captured Leia's nervous smile on the first night. But this camcorder, Emily's camcorder, hadn't been lying in a creek for 2 years like Tyler's. It hadn't been weathered by sun or snow. The damage was newer, fresher. The mud still clung wet to the seams, meaning it hadn't been lying there since 1998, meaning someone or something had moved it long after the original disappearance. Investigators kept this detail from the public. For weeks, a small group of federal and state specialists examined every millimeter of the device. They cleaned it, dried it, cataloged every scratch, and then they found what they didn't want to find. Fibers embedded in the battery compartment. Fibers consistent with fabric from a nylon jacket. A jacket identical to the one Emily had been filming with earlier in the trip. The same one that had recorded their jokes at the gas station. The same one that captured Leia's nervous smile on the first night. But this camcorder, Emily's camcorder, hadn't been lying in a creek for 2 years like Tyler's. It hadn't been weathered by sun or snow. The damage was newer, fresher. The mud still clung wet to the seams, meaning it hadn't been lying there since 1998, meaning someone or something had moved it long after the original disappearance. Investigators kept this detail from the public. For weeks, a small group of federal and state specialists examined every millimeter of the device. They cleaned it, dried it, cataloged every scratch, and then they found what they didn't want to find. Fibers embedded in the battery compartment. Fibers consistent with fabric from a nylon jacket. A jacket identical to the one Emily had been filming with earlier in the trip. The same one that had recorded their jokes at the gas station. The same one that captured Leia's nervous smile on the first night. But this camcorder, Emily's camcorder, hadn't been lying in a creek for 2 years like Tyler's. It hadn't been weathered by sun or snow. The damage was newer, fresher. The mud still clung wet to the seams, meaning it hadn't been lying there since 1998, meaning someone or something had moved it long after the original disappearance. Investigators from the public kept the details within their group. For weeks, a small group of federal and state specialists examined every millimeter of the device. They cleaned it, dried it, cataloged every scratch. And then they found what they didn't want to find. Fibers embedded in the battery compartment. Fibers consistent with fabric from a nylon jacket. A jacket identical to the one Emily had been wearing in the footage from the recovered tape. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The fibers were undamaged, not frayed, not sun-bleached. They appeared to be recent. Everyone in the room knew what that implied, yet no one dared say it out loud. The possibility hung in the air like smoke. Someone had handled the camcorder recently, years after the group disappeared. Still, without the tape, Emily's camera couldn't answer the questions everyone asked at night when the lights were off and the room was too quiet. What happened out there? Did they see something in the woods? Did they run from someone? Or did someone take them? Investigators had no answers, not until 2003, when the digital restoration of the original tape revealed something no one had noticed before. It started with sound, a barely audible voice under the chaos of the final minutes. Not from the group, not from the person holding the camera. Something deeper, distant, mechanical, like a voice shouted through a long metal pipe. 2 words: go back. The audio lab repeated the sample dozens of times. They mapped the frequencies, compared it to environmental noise, wind, leaves, radio interference. They eliminated all of it. The voice did not belong to any of the 7. It didn't match any ranger on duty in 1998. It didn't match internal mic feedback. And most unsettling of all, it came from a point behind the camera, exactly where the silhouette stood. The revelation gutted the families. Some couldn't bear to watch the enhanced footage. Katie's mother fainted the first time she heard the voice. Drew's father punched the wall so hard he broke 2 fingers. Leia's parents sat in silence, hands clasped, eyes closed, as if listening to a ghost. The public reacted with disbelief, fascination, fear. Online forums exploded with theories, some reasonable, most not. A growing subset of amateur investigators became obsessed with the tower, convinced it was the key to everything. They weren't entirely wrong. That same summer, a retired ranger named Walter Briggs contacted the sheriff's office. His voice shook on the phone. He didn't want to be recorded. He didn't want his name used publicly, but he needed to say something he'd held in for years. In 1989, long before the camper disappearance, the tower on Black Hollow Ridge had been officially discommissioned. The public paperwork claimed structural decay, weather damage, budget cuts. Briggs said the real reason was different. A surveyor and a trainee ranger had vanished that year, both last seen near the tower, neither ever found. What the official report didn't mention was the detail Briggs remembered most. Their radios malfunctioned that day. Compass needles drifted off course, and the last transmission from the trainee ranger was a shaky, confused sentence. "Sir, something's in the trees." The line went dead seconds later. Briggs had begged his supervisors to close the area. A week later, the trail was removed from all updated maps. Years passed. Rangers transferred. The forest swallowed the rumors like it swallowed everything else. But Black Hollow Ridge never stopped humming. Investigators pulled the old records. They found the sealed file on the trainee. They found one photo of the surveyor's last known location, standing beside the base of the same tower, visible in the camper's footage. And they found one more thing. A folded memo dated October 1989. Cease all patrols to tower site. Reports of auditory disturbances persist. Recommend reassignment of lookout responsibilities. Area restricted indefinitely. 2 decades later, that memo resurfaced just as the cold case unit reactivated the investigation. Technology had advanced. Drones could scan impossible terrain. Ground-penetrating radar could detect voids beneath the forest floor. Satellite imagery revealed subtle depressions hidden beneath dense canopy. In June 2016, mapping drones identified irregular terrain less than a mile from where Tyler's camcorder had been found. A near-perfect circular depression ringed with collapsed soil. When radar pulses were directed over it, the results were unmistakable. Empty space below, a cavity, a shaft, a place where Earth had given way long ago. A week later, excavation began. The first layers yielded nothing. Just mud, rock, broken branches, the usual debris of a forgotten forest floor. Then, at roughly 20 feet down, a metal beam emerged, rotting timber, rusted bolts, the unmistakable mouth of an old mine ventilation shaft. The cameras lowered into the opening revealed it all clearly. Broken wooden supports, twisted metal, a collapsed floor, and debris scattered across the bottom like offerings. The items were pulled out carefully, one by one. A torn sleeping bag, a rusted cooking pot, a mangled flashlight, fragments of nylon fabric, the corner of a backpack. Tagged, photographed, bagged. Each item was compared against evidence logs, and 2 identifications were confirmed within weeks. Tyler Hayes, Katie Monroe. DNA from small, degraded fibers embedded in the fabrics. It was the first concrete evidence that any member of the group had reached the tower area. The families wept.
Some with relief, others with rage. Closure wasn't closure when only 2 names were answered. Where were the rest? Why had there been no skeletal remains? And why did the items appear arranged, not scattered, as though someone placed them there? Unofficially, investigators whispered the theory no one wanted to write down. Someone moved those items after the campers disappeared. But why? And where were the bodies? The forest wasn't done answering, not yet.
In the weeks after the excavation at the mine shaft, investigators tried to convince themselves, publicly at least, that they were getting closer. But privately, in the closed conference rooms where the evidence was sorted and the questions stacked higher than the answers, there was a feeling none of them could shake. Nothing about the shaft made sense. Forensic anthropologists noted that the sleeping bag fragments, where Tyler and Katie's DNA was found, showed no tearing, no blunt force trauma, nothing to suggest a fall into a 30-foot drop. The cooking pot had no impact dents. The flashlight wasn't shattered. Everything looked placed, deliberately. When one of the younger agents in the room suggested the possibility of post-mortem movement, someone carrying items down into the shaft long after the initial disappearance, no one spoke for several seconds. Then an older investigator closed the folder in front of him. "Don't put that in writing," he said quietly. They didn't. The internal report used safer words, phrases like secondary site disturbance and possible later deposition. But the implication was already clear to everyone in the room. Someone had been at the tower, after the group vanished, after the search ended, before the shaft collapsed for good, and that someone had touched the campers' belongings. The forest had kept its secret for 18 years, but the evidence was beginning to talk. And what it said wasn't comforting. Still, the discovery left the biggest questions unanswered. If 2 campers reached the tower area, where were the other 5? Why hadn't their remains surfaced? Why was there no sign of a camp? No tent poles, no food wrappers, none of the mess 7 young people inevitably leave behind. The shaft only deepened the mystery. And then the footage from the original tape, the one found in 2001, was enhanced again. This time by a private digital forensics firm. Volunteers who had heard about the case, people who had spent years watching blurry frames from internet legends and grainy late 90s camcorder videos. They believed modern restoration tools could reveal more than earlier investigators ever saw. They were right. Using light mapping software, they analyzed the final seconds of the tape, the footage just before the camera swung sharply toward the tower. They slowed the frames, brightened them, extracted tiny reflections from the camcorder's metal casing. And what appeared in that reflection made every person in the room lean closer to the monitor. It wasn't the silhouette from the trees. This was something else. The reflection showed the group walking, Tyler in front, Drew behind him, Katie reaching for the flashlight. Their faces blurred in motion, their breaths visible in rapid little clouds. But just behind them, partially obscured by branches but unmistakable once the glare was removed, stood a figure, a shoulder, the curve of a hat, a faint metallic glint on the chest. The proportions didn't match any of the 7. Investigators compared height, build, posture. Nothing aligned. The figure wore something resembling a ranger's campaign hat. The angle of the brim, the straight posture, the silhouette of an old-style jacket, dark, heavy, not modern issue. And on the chest, catching the weak light of the flashlight beam, a small, reflective badge shape. But the badge wasn't shaped like modern U.S. Forest Service insignia. It matched an older style, one discontinued decades earlier. When the clip was shown to the families, slowly, softly, in a private meeting room, the reactions varied in heartbreaking ways. Emily's mother whispered, "That's not possible." Jordan's sister stared at the screen, shaking her head as if refusing to allow the image to exist. Tyler's father sat forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the faint outline. When the frame froze on the hat's silhouette, he exhaled a shaky breath. "That," he said quietly, "is a person. That's someone behind them." No one disputed him. Investigators dug into old ranger records, combing through dusty binders and forgotten microfilm. They found mention of a lookout assigned to that tower in the early 1970s, a volunteer named Robert Clay. He vanished in 1974. His final logbook entry mentioned voices below the ridge. The tower was closed soon after. And now, decades later, a figure resembling that same uniform appeared behind the 7 missing students. A ghost? A person still alive in the woods? A trick of light? No one could claim certainty, but everyone felt the same chill settle in their bones. If someone had followed the group that night, if someone had been at the tower before them, if someone had been living out there all those years, what had the students actually walked toward? Investigators returned to Black Hollow Ridge one last time in late 2016. The excavation site was sealed, the tower fenced off, but federal agents wanted to explore the surrounding area, one last sweep before snowfall. 7 rangers moved through the clearing with metal detectors and shovels. The silence was crushing. The forest felt heavier than before, as if the air resisted their movement. Even the wind held back its breath. The detectors pinged repeatedly around the tower's base, rusted bolts, old lookout tools, fragments of radio equipment. Nothing meaningful, nothing that explained the missing 5. Then one of the cadaver dogs froze, not beside the tower, but several yards behind it. The soil looked normal, thick with pine needles, moss, and years of fallen leaves. But beneath it lay a network of roots, twisted and knotted like fingers gripping whatever the forest wanted to keep. The dog whimpered. The handler marked the spot. Rangers dug carefully. 6 inches, a foot, 18 inches, 2 feet. Nothing. But the soil carried a faint smell. Old, metallic, almost electric. A smell several of the older rangers recognized immediately. The same smell reported in 1989, the same smell logged in missing person reports decades earlier, the same smell investigators noted in the shaft. Something old, something unnatural, something wrong. They filled the hole and marked the coordinates. Excavation deeper would require structural support they didn't have. Winter storms were approaching. The forest would soon be inaccessible. The team left reluctantly. But yet every person on that crew described the same feeling as they walked away, a sense of being watched. Not by wildlife, not by each other, by something still in the trees, something that had been there a long time, something waiting. The official report from that 2016 investigation was careful, restrained, sterile. It did not mention the dog's reaction. It did not reference the smell. It did not describe the sensation felt by every ranger as they stepped back into the clearing. But among themselves, they spoke plainly. It's not done out there. It's still moving. It doesn't want us digging. For some of the younger agents, the forest was simply unsettling. But for the older ones, those who had worked these hills for decades, recognized something deeper. The same quiet dread they had felt in 1998. The same silence. The same wrongness. And years later, when the case resurfaced once more, it wouldn't be because of a new discovery in the forest. It would come from something investigators had overlooked on the original tape, something tiny, something waiting in the static,
something that finally made them question whether those 7 young people ever walked into those woods alone.
By the time the 20th anniversary of the disappearance approached, the case had grown into a kind of regional legend. People whispered about it in diners. Local kids dared each other to hike near Black Hollow Ridge at night. Online forums spun theories ranging from tragic accidents to supernatural encounters. But for the families, the ones still waking up every day to the same empty space at the table, there was no legend. Just a hole that never healed. Then in 2022, long after most investigators had retired, long after the tower collapsed under its own rust and rot, a documentary team reached out. They weren't thrill seekers or conspiracy hunters. They specialized in long-form investigative storytelling, the kind that crossed every T and documented every heartbreak with careful attention. They wanted to revisit the case from the beginning, to pull apart every thread, to examine every grainy frame, to put the puzzle back together, piece by painful piece. Some of the families refused. They couldn't relive it again. Others agreed, knowing time was running out for any new answers. The producers contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and requested permission to restore segments of the original tape with modern software. Surprisingly, the TBI agreed. Maybe they hoped fresh technology would succeed where theirs had failed. The documentary team got to work. The footage most people had seen online was heavily compressed, copied and recopied until details disappeared into foggy static. But now, using state-of-the-art enhancement tools, analysts were able to isolate specific frames and sharpen details that had been invisible in 1998. Even before the public release, investigators who previewed the restored footage said it felt like watching a nightmare develop in real time. The laughter, the shaky flashlight beam, the frantic breathing, the metallic clanging, the whisper, "Someone's out there." But what truly changed the investigation was something no cold case detective had ever thought to examine closely. The reflection. Not the silhouette in the trees, but the tiny, near-invisible reflection on the camcorder's metal housing. When the new forensic team slowed the footage to 1/20th of its speed and applied light extraction software, the reflection sharpened, grain by grain, pixel by pixel. What emerged was clearer than anyone expected. A figure, standing several feet behind the group, not blurred by motion, not distorted by shadow, not a smear of lights or digital artifact. A person, tall, still, watching. The clothing was the key. A dark green jacket, khaki trousers, and on the head, a ranger-style campaign hat with a broad, flat brim. It wasn't modern U.S. Forest Service issue. The design matched uniforms from the early 1970s, the same era when the Black Hollow Lookout Tower was operational, the same era when Ranger Robert Clay vanished without a trace. His last logbook entry, found in an old storage facility during documentary production, breathed new life into the mystery. Voices again tonight, coming from below the ridge. 2 days later, he vanished. His supervisor wrote a single line beneath the entry, "Tower closed until further notice." When the documentary aired, the episode featuring the enhanced reflection went viral. Not because the show sensationalized the story, but because the footage was undeniable. A real, physical figure stood behind the 7 campers in their final minutes. Someone who was not part of their group. Someone wearing a uniform from 24 years earlier. Experts debated the footage on national television. Some insisted it was a ranger, alive, lost, suffering from mental illness, perhaps living off-grid. Others said it must have been a hiker coincidentally nearby. Skeptics blamed pareidolia, the brain-seen patterns where none existed. But for the families, the ones still waking up every day to the same empty space at the table, there was no legend, just a hole that never healed. Tyler's father appeared in the final act of the documentary, seated at his kitchen table, the camera catching the tremor in his hands. He said, "I always believed someone was with them out there. I don't know who it was, but someone stepped out of those trees." Emily's sister held a framed photo close and whispered, "At least now we know they weren't imagining it." The documentary went further, laying out timelines and maps. It compared the 1998 disappearance to Clay's disappearance in 1974. It highlighted similarities: malfunctioning compasses, dead radios, the same section of ridge, the same unmarked trail. The case that once seemed like a tragic hiking accident now appeared connected to something far older. The filmmakers even examined weather logs, geological surveys, and archival ranger reports. They noted strange patterns in the region, anomalous magnetic readings, documented auditory illusions, and unexplained ground vibrations, and repeated accounts of voices echoing through the valley in storms. For the first time in decades, the story felt less like a mystery and more like a warning. The documentary ended with a shot of the forest as it looks today, quiet, sunlit, deceptively peaceful. Drones glided over the collapsed tower site, the metal legs twisted and half swallowed by moss and vine. Mist drifted between the trees. The voiceover posed a final question that lingered long after the screen faded. If someone, or something, told them to go back, what were they walking toward? And then came the sound. Soft, faint, almost lost beneath the ending music. Breathing. The same slow, shaky breathing captured on the final seconds of the camper tape. The documentary team insisted it was part of the original audio. Viewers debated whether it was an editing glitch. Others said the sound gave them nightmares. But for those who had been involved in the investigation for years, who had watched the tape late at night and stared at the silhouettes and read every field report until the words blurred, there was something familiar about that sound. It didn't just feel like the camper's last moments. It felt like someone else's presence. Someone who had been there before. Someone who remained. In the weeks following the documentary's release, the TBI tip lines flooded with calls. People claimed they heard strange noises near Black Hollow Ridge while hiking. Others said they saw movement in the trees after dark. A few, quietly anonymously, said they'd seen a figure wearing an old ranger hat watching them from a distance. But the most disturbing messages came from investigators who returned to review the footage again. One analyst paused the tape at a seemingly unimportant moment, just before the group started moving toward the tower. The reflection clearly showed the figure behind them, but this time, the analyst noticed something else. A second reflection, even smaller, even quicker. Not behind the group, but beside the tower. Something metallic, something eye-shaped. Something catching the flashlight beam for a fraction of a second, and then gone. The case wasn't just reopened, it was reborn. Because whatever happened to those 7 young people, whatever stood behind them, whatever waited at the tower, wasn't finished. Not yet.
By early 2023, the case wasn't just cold. It had become something different, something heavier. Something that no longer lived in evidence boxes or archived field notes, but in the uneasy space where unanswered questions settle. After the documentary aired, pressure mounted for one more official review. Enough time had passed, enough technology had changed, and the reflection in the restored footage, the man in the 1970s Ranger uniform, had ignited far more than curiosity. So the Tennessee Cold Case Unit, partnering with federal geospatial analysts, returned to the one place that had remained untouched for years, Black Hollow Ridge. The forest looked the same, still, vast, a green ocean rolling across the mountains. But the people who stepped into it this time carried decades of knowledge with them. They knew where the maps had lied. They knew where compasses drifted. They knew where the soil thinned, where the roots twisted into unnatural knots over the old mining veins beneath. And for the first time, they knew they weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for answers. Drones swept overhead. Radar units pulsed beneath the forest floor. Cadaver dogs moved slow and tense, ears flicking at the smallest vibrations. Their handlers kept glancing over their shoulders, whispering that something felt off, like the wind was moving wrong. On the second day, just past noon, a drone flagged an unusual pattern of collapsed soil less than 60 yards behind where the tower once stood, a perfect circle nearly 15 feet across. The vegetation growing on top looked younger than the surrounding forest, as if the earth had opened there once and closed again. Investigators marked the site. Then they started digging. The first layers were unremarkable: soil, pine needles, black loam damp from a week of rain. But as the excavation deepened, the ground shifted in ways dirt shouldn't. It was soft where it should have been compact, loose where roots should have anchored it.
A geologist on the team knelt and touched the soil. "This ground has been disturbed," she said. "Not recently, but not 25 years ago either." They dug deeper. At 2 feet, broken roots. At 3 feet, a piece of fabric. At 4 feet, a thin wooden slat. At 5 feet, a rusted metal hinge. At 6 feet, empty air. A void. Another chamber. But this one wasn't a mine shaft. The walls curved inward, not cut by tools. The space was too round, too uniform, as though shaped by pressure from within rather than carved from without. When a small camera was lowered inside, the feed showed collapsed debris, branches, loose soil, and something else. Something pale, smooth, angular. Investigators froze the frame. A tech zoomed in, pixel by pixel, a jawbone. Human. The chamber was too unstable to enter. Heavy equipment would risk collapsing the entire ridge. They recovered what fragments they safely could. Small pieces of bone, degraded cloth, a partially crushed metal clasp the size of a wallet clip. The bones were too eroded to identify by appearance alone. But DNA testing would answer that. Everyone packed up early that night. Even the seasoned investigators found it hard to breathe in that clearing. The air felt weighted, as if the forest wanted them gone. And when they finally hiked back to base camp, one ranger swore he heard a voice behind him, faint, distant, carried on the wind. Go back. He refused to return to the ridge the next day. The fragments were sent to the federal lab. Weeks passed. The families waited again. Most of them knew better than to expect closure. But this time, something felt different. The discovery wasn't random. It wasn't an artifact washed through a creek bed or burned in an incomplete fire. This was deliberate. This was a burial. Finally, the results arrived. The jawbone did not match any of the 7 missing campers. It matched someone else. Robert Clay, the ranger who vanished in 1974. Nearly 50 years after he walked onto that ridge, the forest gave back the first piece of him. But Clay was no answer. He was another question. If his remains were there, beneath freshly disturbed soil, why hadn't they been found in earlier searches? Why were they only unearthed after the tower collapsed? And how had items belonging to the campers been found in a separate location entirely, arranged rather than scattered? Something or someone had interacted with both sets of remains. Something that moved through the forest long after the disappearances. Something that rearranged evidence, carried items, placed objects where they didn't belong. That same week, the forensic lab returned one more result, one that almost no one expected. The crushed metal clasp found near Clay's remains wasn't his. It matched a key clip belonging to Jordan McCoy. 2 people, 44 years apart, buried in the same impossible place. Investigators assembled in a conference room to review everything one final time. The footage, the shaft, the reflection, the voice, the soil, the bones, the decades of silence between each disappearance, and the reality felt unmistakable. The 7 campers didn't stumble into simple accidents. Clay hadn't simply gotten lost. None of them died alone. Someone was with them, or something was. Something that kept to the ridge. Something that moved evidence like puzzle pieces. Something that knew the forest better than any map. Something that made compasses drift and radios die. Something that had been there long before 1974. Something that had gotten very good at erasing its presence. The final scene of the 2022 documentary captured the truth better than any report ever could. The camera panning across the moss-covered space where the tower once stood, morning light drifting through the trees, nothing moving, not a bird, not a leaf, just stillness. And then the soft static rising, growing, filling the speakers, until the faintest possible sound emerged beneath it, breathing, slow, steady, watching. The documentary ended there, black screen, silence. But the families knew what the investigators now feared to say aloud. The forest didn't kill them. The ridge didn't swallow them. The woods weren't empty on that August night in 1998. Someone was there. Someone stepped out of the trees. Someone stood behind them. And if you hike deep enough into Black Hollow Ridge today, locals say you can still hear it in the quiet, just past sunset, when the wind dies. The slow, patient rhythm of a breath that didn't belong to you. Waiting, just like it always has.
Just like it always will. The forest doesn't give everything back, but sometimes just enough to make you remember.